Willpower is not some mystical force or an innate trait that a lucky few are born with while the rest of us are left struggling. Rather, it is a highly trainable neural process, governed by specific brain circuits and deeply intertwined with the way your body and brain regulate energy, stress, emotion, and decision-making. To truly understand how to build willpower, we need to look at what's happening in the nervous system when you're resisting temptation, pushing through discomfort, or choosing to act in alignment with your long-term goals rather than short-term gratification. At the most fundamental level, willpower involves the interaction between different brain regions, particularly the prefrontal cortex, which is located right behind your forehead, and deeper, evolutionarily older structures like the amygdala and the basal ganglia. The prefrontal cortex is the command center for rational decision, making, goal setting, and suppressing impulses. It is the seat of what neuroscientists call top-down control. When you resist hitting the snooze button, when you choose a salad over junk food, when you stay calm during an argument, your prefrontal cortex is exercising top-down regulation over more primitive emotional and instinctual circuits. But here's the critical insight: that top-down control is not fixed. It's not static. Like any other process in the brain, it can be strengthened with practice. You can train your willpower much like you train a muscle. And just as muscles require resistance and recovery to grow stronger, your willpower circuits require challenge and repetition, followed by restoration and rest. The first step in this training process is developing awareness. You can't improve what you don't monitor. Most people experience lapses in willpower because they rely entirely on conscious thought to override emotion or craving in the moment. But the conscious mind is easily fatigued. Willpower needs to be embedded in automatic processes, and that starts by recognizing patterns when you tend to lose control, what situations or times of day challenge your discipline, and what your physiological and emotional states are in those moments. What's fascinating from a neuroscience perspective is that willpower actually draws upon a limited pool of cognitive and physiological resources. Studies using functional MRI have shown that tasks requiring high self-control increase activation in the anterior cingulate cortex and dorsolateral prefrontal cortex. These are energy-demanding areas. That means using willpower is literally metabolically expensive. It burns glucose. It depletes neurochemicals, and that's why decision fatigue is real. After a long day of making hard choices or dealing with emotional stress, the brain has fewer resources available to regulate impulses. That's when you're most vulnerable to poor decisions, reactive behavior, or giving up on your goals. But here's the encouraging part. Just like physical endurance can be built by gradually increasing load and intensity, cognitive endurance, especially willpower, can be developed by deliberately engaging in tasks that require impulse control, sustained attention, or resisting distraction. For example, mindfulness meditation has been shown to increase gray matter density in the prefrontal cortex. That's structural change. That means the circuits responsible for willpower are physically growing stronger with consistent mental training. There's another dimension to this. The nervous system is designed to adapt to challenge, and this adaptation depends on what's called neuroplasticity, the brain's ability to rewire itself in response to experience. But neuroplasticity is not always on. It's gated by specific neurochemical states. When we are deeply focused, mildly agitated, or emotionally engaged, especially when we are slightly outside of our comfort zone, our brain is more likely to change. So when you push yourself to follow through on a hard task, resist a craving, or choose to delay gratification, and you do so in a state of heightened attention and intention, you're not just winning a battle of willpower in that moment, you're literally shaping your brain's future capacity for discipline. One of the most powerful forms of willpower training involves what's called friction management. You deliberately create small forms of friction between yourself and the behaviors you want to avoid. Let's say you want to check your phone less. If the phone is sitting right next to you within reach, your brain has to expend tremendous energy every few minutes to resist the urge to pick it up. That's inefficient, but if you leave it in another room or log out of the most addictive apps, you reduce the frequency of internal resistance. You train your brain to associate ease and flow with deep work, not distraction. Over time, this restructuring of your environment supports the wiring of new habits. The friction helps automate discipline. Conversely, you can reduce friction around the habits you want to strengthen. If your goal is to exercise every morning, but your gym clothes are hidden somewhere in the closet, your brain faces a micro barrier that depletes willpower before the actual workout even begins. But if you lay them out the night before, you're priming your brain to associate momentum with preparation. These small manipulations reduce the number of decisions you need to make, and fewer decisions mean less decision fatigue, meaning more energy available for willpower when you really need it. Let's also address the role of stress in willpower. Stress degrades willpower. This has been well documented both in psychological and physiological studies. When you're under stress, your body releases cortisol and adrenaline. In moderate amounts, this can help focus you. But chronic stress floods the brain with neurochemicals that impair prefrontal cortex function. That's why people under long-term stress often feel impulsive, overwhelmed, or stuck in loops of self-sabotage. But again, the nervous system can be trained. Cold exposure is a great example. When you deliberately expose your body to a stressor like cold water, just 2 to 3 minutes in a cold shower or plunge, you activate the stress response, but in a controlled setting. Over time, your brain learns to tolerate discomfort. You raise your threshold for what counts as a threat. And that has downstream effects: better emotional regulation, more resilient willpower, and improved capacity to pause and choose your response rather than reacting from impulse. Breathwork is another entry point. Slow, deliberate nasal breathing, especially extending your exhale longer than your inhale, activates the parasympathetic nervous system, calming the body and restoring your willpower reserve. On the flip side, brief bouts of intense breathing, such as physiological size, 2 inhales followed by a slow exhale, can rapidly bring your brain back online after moments of stress, restoring your capacity for focus and self-control. There's also a connection between sleep and willpower. During deep sleep, particularly slow-wave sleep, the brain undergoes synaptic homeostasis, a resetting of the neural circuits involved in focus, decision-making, and emotion regulation. If you're sleep-deprived, your prefrontal cortex function is compromised. You become more reactive, less reflective. So if you want to build willpower, you need to protect your sleep. That means going to bed and waking up at consistent times, avoiding caffeine too late in the day, and minimizing blue light exposure in the hour before sleep to preserve natural melatonin in release. Another crucial practice is task bracketing, or how you frame the beginning and end of a challenging task. Research shows that the brain responds powerfully to the first and last few minutes of any behavior. If you can consistently show up at the same time each day, start with a familiar ritual, and close the session with reflection or reward, you encode that behavior more deeply into memory. This makes future resistance lower. Your nervous system begins to anticipate the challenge and generates dopamine in advance. That forward-facing dopamine is the fuel for willpower. And speaking of dopamine, let's be clear. Dopamine is not about pleasure. It's about motivation and pursuit. When your brain releases dopamine in response to progress, effort, or even struggle, you're reinforcing the neural circuits that make willpower sustainable. That's why it's important to reward the effort, not just the outcome. When you recognize yourself for showing up and staying consistent, even if results are slow, you're tapping into the deep biological mechanisms that drive long-term behavior change. So building willpower is really about building a new identity. Every time you resist the easy path and choose the intentional one, you're not just delaying gratification. You're teaching your brain who you are. You're rewriting the algorithms that guide your choices. Over time, what once required great effort becomes automatic. That's the essence of neuroplasticity. Ultimately, willpower is a trainable neural process because your brain is an adaptive organ. It's constantly responding to your actions, your environment, and your internal states. The more you understand how to create the right inputs, challenge, focus, rest, recovery, the more you can engineer your nervous system to support discipline. You stop relying on motivation and start relying on structure. You stop reacting and start designing your behavior. And that shift from reactive to intentional, from effortful to automatic, is where true willpower lives. It's not just something you use. It's something you become. The human brain is an extraordinarily complex system, and at the very top of that system sits the prefrontal cortex, a region of the brain that plays a central role in decision-making, goal-directed behavior, emotional regulation, and most importantly for our topic today, willpower. When we talk about the ability to exercise restraint, resist temptations, delay gratification, and maintain discipline, we're really talking about how the prefrontal cortex exerts top-down control over more primitive brain regions. From an evolutionary standpoint, the prefrontal cortex is the newest part of the brain. It's what allows us to plan, to imagine future outcomes, and to resist acting purely on impulse. It governs our ability to suppress automatic responses and choose deliberate actions aligned with long-term goals. Essentially, the prefrontal cortex is the seat of executive function, and that executive function is what makes willpower possible. But this system doesn't operate in isolation. The brain is highly interconnected. The prefrontal cortex is in constant communication with older, deeper structures like the amygdala, which governs emotional reactivity and fear, and the hypothalamus, which controls hunger, thirst, arousal, and other survival-driven urges. It also interacts with the basal ganglia, which are involved in habit formation and reward processing. When you encounter a temptation, say, a slice of cake when you're trying to eat clean, your hypothalamus and reward circuits are triggered first. The job of the prefrontal cortex is to step in and say, wait, that may feel good now, but does it serve your longer-term goals? This process, this moment of pause and redirection, is the essence of top-down control, and it's trainable. The strength of the communication between the prefrontal cortex and subcortical regions is not fixed. It is influenced by experience, environment, attention, stress, and even physical health. The more often you engage these circuits, the more efficient they become. The axons connecting these areas are myelinated with use, speeding up transmission. You become better and faster at overriding emotional or instinctual impulses. Think of top-down control as the brain's braking system. In any given moment, there are competing neural impulses. One part of your brain is saying, go for it, just do it. Another part is saying, pause, consider the consequences. The prefrontal cortex is the part that lets you apply the brakes when needed. And like any braking system, it can wear down or overheat under too much strain. That's why chronic stress, poor sleep, fatigue, and emotional exhaustion all reduce your capacity for self-regulation. They reduce the efficacy of top-down control. Let's go deeper into the mechanics. The prefrontal cortex is not a monolithic structure. Different parts are responsible for different functions. The dorsolateral prefrontal cortex, for instance, is involved in working memory and planning. It helps you hold an intention in mind and sequence actions to achieve it. The ventromedial prefrontal cortex is more involved in emotional regulation and value-based decision-making. It evaluates trade-offs, whether a reward now is worth more than a reward later. The anterior cingulate cortex helps you detect conflicts between competing goals or actions. It acts like an internal alert system, flagging moments when your behavior is misaligned with your intentions. All of these areas work together to create the cognitive architecture of willpower, and the strength and efficiency of these systems can be enhanced through targeted interventions. For example, cognitive training tasks like the Stroop test or back exercises challenge the brain to inhibit automatic responses and maintain focus under pressure. These tasks have been shown to increase activation and even structural connectivity in prefrontal areas. Similarly, mindfulness meditation increases functional connectivity between the prefrontal cortex and the insula. the region of the brain that helps you monitor internal sensations like hunger, pain, and emotional arousal. This connectivity is crucial because it helps you notice the rise of an impulse early, giving the prefrontal cortex a better chance to intervene. Another important factor in strengthening top-down control is interoception, the ability to sense the internal state of the body. The prefrontal cortex relies on accurate feedback from the body to make good decisions. If your nervous system is flooded with stress signals, fast heart rate, shallow breathing, tense muscles, it interprets that as a threat. This pushes your brain toward reactive decision making. The amygdala gains the upper hand, but if you can regulate your internal state, you maintain a calm baseline. This allows the prefrontal cortex to stay online, to keep you in reflective mode rather than reactive mode. That's why breathwork, body scanning, and even simply learning to recognize the physical sensations associated with cravings or emotional states can be such powerful tools. They give the prefrontal cortex more data, more time, and more opportunity to apply control. You're no longer a passive recipient of emotion. You become an active participant in your decision making. There's also a very important relationship between the prefrontal cortex and the neurotransmitter dopamine. Dopamine is often misunderstood as just the pleasure chemical, but in reality, it's much more about motivation and forward movement. The prefrontal cortex uses dopamine signals to evaluate potential outcomes and to update strategies based on success or failure. When you anticipate a reward, dopamine rises. But when that reward is tied to effort, your prefrontal cortex is engaged more deeply. That's why learning to enjoy the process, not just the outcome, is critical. You're wiring your brain to favor long-term, effort-based rewards over short-term hits of gratification. In practical terms, that means setting small, achievable goals and recognizing your progress. It means learning to savor the effort, the challenge, the discipline itself, not just the result. Every time you override an impulse and act in alignment with your values, you should mentally reward that act. This reinforces prefrontal circuits and makes future decisions easier. Over time, the brain begins to predict reward not just from outcomes, but from identity, consistent action. That shift is what transforms behavior from willpower into habit. Sleep also plays a vital role here. The prefrontal cortex is one of the most metabolically active regions of the brain, and it is especially sensitive to sleep loss. Even a single night of insufficient sleep can significantly impair your ability to inhibit impulses. That's because during deep sleep, the glymphatic system clears out metabolic waste from the brain, and there is a restoration of synaptic homeostasis. Without this process, the prefrontal cortex becomes noisy and inefficient. Signals don't get transmitted cleanly. Emotional reactivity increases. You're more likely to act on autopilot or fall into habits rather than deliberate action. Stress, of course, is another major factor. Chronic stress leads to prolonged elevation of cortisol, which over time can cause atrophy in the prefrontal cortex and hypertrophy in the amygdala. In simple terms, your emotional brain gets louder and your rational brain gets quieter. This is a neuroplastic shift in the wrong direction. But it's reversible. Techniques like gratitude journaling, mindfulness, regular physical activity, and even cold exposure all modulate the stress response. They reduce baseline cortisol and increase heart rate variability, a measure of your capacity to engage the prefrontal cortex under stress. It's also important to understand that top-down control doesn't always mean suppressing emotion. Sometimes it means redirecting it. The prefrontal cortex can engage other regions like the nucleus accumbens to reframe experiences, to shift from avoidance to approach. If you're afraid of public speaking, for example, you can use your prefrontal cortex to reframe that fear as excitement. This process, called cognitive reappraisal, is one of the most effective tools in the neuroscience of emotion regulation. It engages prefrontal systems to literally change the meaning of emotional stimuli, and with practice, it becomes faster and more automatic. One of the most powerful ways to train top top-down control is to deliberately engage in small acts of self-regulation every day. This could be anything from delaying your morning coffee by 30 minutes to taking a cold shower, to pausing before responding to a frustrating message. These micro moments of discipline serve as reps for your willpower circuits, and the brain doesn't distinguish much between small and large acts of self-control. What matters is the repetition and intensity of engagement. The more you practice pausing, noticing, and choosing your response, the more automatic that sequence becomes. There's a concept in neuroscience called Hebbian learning, often summarized as neurons that fire together wire together. When you repeatedly activate the prefrontal cortex in situations that require willpower, you strengthen the synaptic connections between these regions and the behaviors you want to reinforce. You make the process of self-control more efficient, more fluid, and more aligned with your identity. So ultimately, top-down control is the biological foundation for what we call willpower. It's not magic, it's mechanics. It's the result of a finely tuned interplay between attention, emotion, physiology, and experience. And it is absolutely trainable. The key is consistency. You don't need to make perfect decisions all the time. You just need to engage the process regularly enough that it becomes who you are. You start to trust yourself not because of wishful thinking, but because your nervous system has been conditioned through repeated practice to align with your highest goals and values. That's real willpower, and it begins and ends in the prefrontal cortex. When we think about willpower, we often view it as purely psychological, something that lives in our minds, shaped by motivation, personality, or grit. But what neuroscience tells us is that willpower is deeply embodied. It is regulated not only by what we think, but by how we breathe, how we move, what we look at, how we sleep, and how we stimulate or calm our nervous system. Your physiology, your body state at any given moment, directly shapes your capacity to act with discipline and to override impulses. And perhaps one of the most underutilized tools for building willpower is your ability to consciously change your internal state through deliberate physiological actions. The nervous system is the foundation of all your behaviors. It controls your ability to focus, to regulate emotion, to plan, to resist urges, and to follow through on difficult tasks. And the key here is that your nervous system is bidirectional. That means while your brain sends commands to the body is also constantly sending signals back to the brain. What this means in practice is that if you want to shift your state, say, from distracted to focused, from reactive to deliberate, you can use the body as the entry point. You don't have to rely only on thoughts or motivation. You can use your physiology to prime your brain for willpower. Let's begin with breathing. Breathing is the one autonomic function that you can control at will. It's automatic, but it can also be manual. That makes it a powerful lever for influencing the autonomic nervous system, the system that regulates your internal balance between alertness and calm. When you inhale, your heart rate speeds up slightly, which activates the sympathetic or alertness, promoting branch of your nervous system. When you exhale, your heart rate slows down, activating the parasympathetic or calming branch. One of the most effective breathing tools for willpower is called the physiological sigh. It's a pattern of 2 inhales through the nose, 1 full, then 1 short top, off, inhale followed by a long, extended exhale through the mouth. This technique was discovered through decades of research on stress and respiration. It's been shown to rapidly calm the nervous system and restore cognitive control. When you're feeling overwhelmed, anxious, or impulsive, a single physiological sigh can reset your internal state within seconds. And when your state is calm and focused, your prefrontal cortex, your brain's willpower center, is much more likely to stay online. Another breathing technique is deliberate, slow nasal breathing. Breathing at a pace of around 5 to 6 breaths per minute, ideally through the nose, helps balance oxygen and carbon dioxide levels in the blood. This has been shown to improve heart rate variability, which is a key biomarker of your ability to regulate stress. People with higher heart rate variability are more resilient, better at regulating emotion, and have stronger impulse control. So, when you engage in this kind of breath work regularly, even just 5 minutes a day, you're training your nervous system to stay regulated under pressure, which is exactly what willpower requires. But breath isn't the only access point. Vision is another powerful tool. Your eyes are actually part of your central nervous system. The retina is neural tissue, and how you use your eyes affects the state of your brain and body. When you're stressed or distracted, your vision tends to narrow. You go into what's called focal vision, where your field of view tightens. This activates the sympathetic nervous system, increasing internal arousal and making it harder to stay calm and focused. But you can flip the switch by deliberately widening your gaze, what we call panoramic or optic flow vision. You activate the parasympathetic system. Simply by looking at the horizon or by softening your focus and taking in your entire visual field, you can calm your nervous system. This is a simple, nonverbal way to transition your brain into a state that supports long-term decision-making and reduces impulsivity. So before a challenging task, or when you feel willpower starting to fade, just 30 to 60 seconds of panoramic vision can reset your state. You can also use movement to shift your physiology. Walking, especially in natural environments, provides a built-in form of optic flow, the movement of visual scenery past your eyes as you walk forward. Optic flow is known to reduce amygdala activity and lower stress levels. This kind of movement is rhythmically soothing to the nervous system and promotes the brain state most conducive to cognitive control. This is why people often feel more clear-headed or emotionally balanced after a walk. But it's not just about emotional balance. It's about neurobiological readiness to make disciplined choices. Cold exposure is another potent tool for training willpower through physiology. When you immerse yourself in cold water, whether it's a cold shower, a cold plunge, or exposure to cold air, you activate the sympathetic nervous system. But because the stressor is controlled and time-limited, your brain begins to adapt. Over time, this kind of deliberate cold exposure increases your capacity to tolerate discomfort. It trains your nervous system to stay calm under stress and builds resilience. You learn biologically that you can face something hard and survive. And that carries over into other areas of life. You become better at delaying gratification, enduring discomfort, and sticking to your goals even when it's hard. The key here is deliberate exposure. You're choosing to step into the stressor. That choice is what rewires your brain. It reinforces the neural circuits associated with agency, discipline, and identity. You're telling your nervous system, I can handle this, I am not reactive, I choose. And over time, your threshold for what constitutes hard increases. That translates to stronger willpower in daily life. Posture is another underestimated physiological signal. Studies have shown that your posture affects your emotional state, hormone levels, and cognitive function. When you slouch or collapse your body, you send signals of defeat or low energy to the brain. This diminishes your motivation and weakens top-down control. But when you sit or stand upright, shoulders back, chest open, eyes forward, you increase alertness and confidence. This posture primes your brain to take on challenges rather than avoid them. In fact, there's research showing that upright posture improves working memory, increases focus, and reduces the likelihood of giving up on difficult tasks. So the way you carry your body isn't just about appearance. It's a direct input to your nervous system. And the nervous system, in turn, dictates how much willpower you have available at any given moment. Let's also talk about nutrition and hydration, basic physiological factors that have enormous influence on the brain's capacity for discipline. Low blood glucose, dehydration, and poor electrolyte balance can impair prefrontal cortex function. When your brain lacks the energy or hydration it needs, you become more reactive and less capable of making thoughtful choices. That's why staying hydrated, eating foods that provide stable blood sugar, and avoiding high sugar spikes are foundational for sustaining willpower. Caffeine can be a helpful tool, too, when used strategically. Caffeine increases dopamine and norepinephrine in the brain, which can enhance alertness and motivation. But timing matters. Caffeine consumed too early, too often, or too late in the day can disrupt sleep and overstimulate the nervous system. The best use of caffeine is to delay intake by 90 to 120 minutes after waking, which allows natural cortisol levels to peak. This preserves your energy curve throughout the day and supports better sleep at night, which is essential, as sleep deprivation severely impairs willpower. Speaking of sleep, it is arguably the most powerful physiological reset we have. During sleep, especially deep non-REM sleep, the brain clears out metabolic waste, restores dopamine receptor sensitivity, and strengthens memory and executive function. If your sleep is compromised, the very circuits that govern discipline and self-control begin to malfunction. You are more prone to mood swings, cravings, distraction, and decision fatigue. So no matter how motivated you are, if your sleep is off, your physiology will work against your willpower. That brings us to one of the most practical frameworks for integrating physiology into daily willpower practice, NSDR or non-sleep deep rest. These are protocols like yoga nidra or certain forms of guided hypnosis that allow the body and brain to enter deeply restorative states even during the day. Research shows that just 10 to 20 minutes of NSDR can restore dopamine levels, increase focus, and reduce stress. This gives you a powerful reset button for your nervous system without the need for a nap. In a world full of overstimulation and fatigue, this is a vital tool for preserving and restoring willpower. One of the most important things to understand is that your capacity for willpower is not static throughout the day. It fluctuates based on circadian rhythms, energy availability, stress exposure, and nervous system regulation. By using physiological tools at the right times, such as breathwork before difficult conversations, cold exposure in the morning to build grit, panoramic vision before focus sessions, or NSDR in the afternoon to recover cognitive control, you can strategically prime your brain and body to support discipline. Over time, these tools do more than just shift your state temporarily. They train your nervous system. They condition your brain to respond with resilience rather than reactivity. You begin to default to focus, calm, and control. And that's the goal, not to fight through every moment of weakness, but to build a system in which discipline becomes the natural state. You engineer your physiology so that it supports your highest intentions. This is why understanding willpower through the lens of the body is so empowering. You're not just a passenger at the mercy of thoughts and feelings. You are the operator of a highly adaptable system. You can tune that system every day in small ways to increase your capacity for focus, discipline, and follow through. The more you practice, the more you embed these physiological tools into your life. And eventually, willpower becomes less about forcing yourself to act and more about setting the stage for the best version of you to show up, reliably, consistently, and effortlessly. If there's one molecule in the brain that shapes the architecture of behavior more than any other, it's dopamine. And when it comes to building willpower, understanding dopamine, how it works, how it's released, and how it influences our actions becomes absolutely essential. Contrary to what many people believe, dopamine isn't just about pleasure. It's not simply the chemical you get when you eat something tasty or win a prize. Dopamine is much more fundamental than that. It is the molecule of motivation, of pursuit, of effort. It's what drives you to act and to keep acting, especially in the face of challenge. The human brain has evolved to be a goal-seeking machine, and dopamine is the primary neurochemical that underlies this drive. It originates in a cluster of neurons deep in the midbrain, in regions such as the ventral tegmental area, VTA, and substantia nigra, and it projects to multiple areas including the prefrontal cortex, the nucleus accumbens, and the striatum. These pathways make up what we call the mesolimbic and mesocortical dopamine systems, core circuits involved in evaluating reward, predicting outcomes, and modulating behavior accordingly. What's critical to understand is that dopamine is not just released when we achieve a reward. It spikes in anticipation of a reward. In fact, the largest dopamine release typically happens before you reach your goal during the effort phase, when you're actively moving towards something meaningful. This means that your brain is wired not to just enjoy success, but to crave the pursuit itself. And this has profound implications for how we build and sustain willpower. One of the biggest mistakes people make in trying to strengthen their willpower is that they tie their dopamine, and therefore their motivation, entirely to the outcome. They focus only on the result, the weight loss, the finished book, the completed project. But neuroscience shows us that when you link your dopamine solely to outcomes, you are setting yourself up for inconsistency and burnout. Because outcomes are rare, and the journey toward them is often long and filled with friction. If your brain only gets a dopamine hit when you win, it will begin to resist the work. It will look for shortcuts. It will grow impatient and impulsive. But when you learn to attach dopamine to the process, to the effort itself, you rewire your motivation system. You teach your brain that doing the hard thing is the reward. And this fundamentally transforms your relationship with willpower. You're no longer dragging yourself toward a distant finish line. You're fueling yourself with each step forward. This shift is not theoretical. It's neurochemical, and it's achievable through deliberate reframing and practice. For example, if you're studying for an exam or working on a complex task, and you pause to tell yourself, "This effort is making me stronger," or "the struggle is the process of wiring my brain," you are directing your dopamine system to reinforce the act of persistence. Over time, this becomes automatic. You begin to crave the work, not because it's pleasurable in the conventional sense, but because your dopamine system now rewards effortful progress. This is what elite performers across disciplines do intuitively. They've learned to derive satisfaction from the grind, from the repetition, from the practice. They don't wait for external validation to feel motivated. They've built an internal reward system. And the good news is that you don't need special genes or superhuman grit to develop this. You need a shift in how you think about effort and reward. You need to train your dopamine system to light up during the process, not just at the finish line. But here's the nuance. Dopamine is not an unlimited resource. It operates through peaks and baselines. Every time you get a spike in dopamine, whether it's from an accomplishment, a scroll through social media, or a hit of sugar, it's followed by a drop below baseline. This is what creates craving. The brain doesn't like low dopamine, so it begins to seek out the next hit. If you chase repeated high-frequency dopamine spikes, especially from easy, low-effort sources, you're training your system to be short-term focused. You're wiring yourself for impulsivity, not discipline. That's why habits like endless phone checking, binge watching, and constant snacking actually degrade willpower over time. They teach the brain to expect instant gratification. They reduce your sensitivity to dopamine, meaning it takes more stimulation to feel motivated. This is called dopamine downregulation. And it makes disciplined action harder because the high-effort behaviors like exercising, studying, or resisting temptation no longer produce a sufficient reward signal to keep you going. To reverse this, one of the most powerful practices you can engage in is what's called dopamine detoxing, or more accurately, dopamine recalibration. This doesn't mean eliminating all pleasure. It means reducing your exposure to high dopamine, low effort behaviors, and increasing your exposure to moderate dopamine, high effort behaviors. It's a rebalancing of your reward system. When you do this, when you limit overstimulation and instead teach your brain to find reward in effort, you increase your baseline dopamine over time. This means you feel more motivated, more focused, and more willing to tolerate discomfort. You shift from reactive to proactive. From craving to creating, there is also a relationship between dopamine and identity that's crucial for willpower. Each time you engage in a difficult behavior, say you push through resistance to complete a workout, or you write a page of that book you've been avoiding, you get a small dopamine reward. But beyond the chemical spike, there's a deeper message being encoded in your brain. This is who I am. Dopamine doesn't just reinforce the action. It reinforces the identity behind the action. So every time you choose discipline over distraction, you're not just building a habit. You're shaping your self-image. Your brain starts to believe, I am someone who follows through, I am someone who does hard things, and once your identity is aligned with willpower, the need for effort drops. Behavior becomes automatic. That's the neuroscience of self-discipline. It's not about brute force. It's about aligning dopamine, effort, and identity over time. There's another dimension here that involves timing and context. Dopamine is context sensitive. It responds not just to what you do, but to when and how you do it. For example, novelty increases dopamine, so introducing variation into your routines, changing the environment, setting new challenges, rotating focus areas, can keep your motivation high. But at the same time, the most sustainable source of dopamine is predictable progress. When your brain sees that effort leads to forward movement, even small steps, it rewards you. That's why tracking progress, setting micro goals, and measuring consistency are all effective willpower tools. They feed the dopamine system exactly what it craves, evidence that effort works. There's also a physiological component. Dopamine is synthesized from the amino acid tyrosine, which you get from protein, rich foods like eggs, fish, nuts, and beans. The process of creating dopamine also depends on cofactors like vitamin B6, iron, and magnesium. So if your nutrition is lacking, your ability to produce and regulate dopamine suffers. That means your motivation and willpower suffer too. Physical exercise, especially intense cardiovascular exercise, has been shown to upregulate dopamine receptors, making the brain more sensitive to reward. Sleep, once again, plays a foundational role. It restores receptor sensitivity and helps maintain dopamine balance. In fact, one of the reasons people lose discipline when they are tired or malnourished is because the brain simply doesn't have the chemical fuel to support effort. So building willpower isn't just about mindset, it's also about supporting your neurochemistry with sleep, nutrition, movement, and environmental cues. And finally, there's the emotional and social component of dopamine. Acts of kindness, meaningful conversations, and collaboration all increase dopamine. But unlike the fast, fleeting spikes from addictive behaviors, these experiences produce sustainable dopamine release. They enhance mood, motivation, and connection without the crash. So if you want to build long-term willpower, surround yourself with people who support your growth. Engage in work that aligns with your values and find meaning in the process. These aren't just feel-good ideas, they are biologically strategic decisions for maintaining dopamine balance and enhancing your capacity to stay consistent. To summarize, the dopamine system is your brain's primary mechanism for pursuing goals and sustaining effort. When you understand how to manage it, when you stop outsourcing motivation to external rewards and start generating it internally through effort, you gain an extraordinary level of control over your behavior. You become the architect of your own discipline. You learn to enjoy the work, not just the win. You find satisfaction not just in finishing, but in becoming the kind of person who shows up, day after day, regardless of how you feel. This is the neurobiology of willpower at its most powerful. It's not about suppressing desire, it's about redirecting it. It's not about denying reward, it's about rewiring where your reward comes from. And when you master that shift, willpower is no longer a struggle. It becomes your default setting, fueled by dopamine, aligned with effort, and built to last.